There are 5 seconds in history that nobody in that room ever forgot. 5 seconds of absolute, breathless silence in one of the most formal settings in the Western world, where the wrong glance could start a diplomatic incident and the wrong word could end a career. 5 seconds where a man stood perfectly still, cigarette smoke curling lazily from his fingertips, dark eyes fixed on a queen, and did absolutely nothing. No bow, no curtsy, no bend to the knee, nothing. Just Dean Martin, standing there like he owned the room, while every other person in that grand ballroom felt their heart stop beating at exactly the same moment. What happened in those 5 seconds would ripple through Hollywood for decades. It would be whispered about in green rooms and dressing suites, debated by diplomats and gossip columnists, and retold at dinner tables from Los Angeles to London. Some called it arrogance. Some called it courage. Some called it the most perfectly calculated social maneuver in the history of celebrity. And a very few, the ones who actually knew Dean Martin, who understood the machinery behind that easy smile and that lazy charm, said it was something else entirely, something far more complicated, far more human, and far more extraordinary than any of them realized standing in that frozen moment. But to understand what really happened on that night, you have to go back. You have to go back to a small town in Ohio where a boy with cold dust on his boots and a song in his chest first decided that the world was going to know his name. You have to understand who Dean Martin actually was beneath the tuxedo and the tumbler of scotch and the carefully constructed image of effortless cool. Because the man who stood in that ballroom wasn't simply a celebrity refusing a protocol. He was a sum total of every humiliation he'd ever swallowed, every room he'd ever been turned away from, every person who'd ever told him he would never be enough. Dino Paul Crocetti was born in Steubenville, Ohio, in 1917, the son of an Italian barber who spoke almost no English and a mother who filled their small home with the sound of old country songs. Steubenville was a steel town, a hard town, a town that respected muscle and sweat and not much else. The boy who would one day charm queens and presidents grew up in streets where the social hierarchy was enforced with fists, where your last name marked you before you opened your mouth, and where being Italian meant being perpetually, exhaustingly foreign, no matter how many generations your family had been breathing American air. He dropped out of school at 16. Not because he was stupid. Those who knew him well would later say he was one of the sharpest men they'd ever encountered, with memory like a steel trap and an instinct for human nature that bordered on the supernatural. He dropped out because school felt like a cage, because the teachers looked at him like he was already lost, because the future being silently prescribed for him. The mill, the factory, the slow grinding down of ambition until it fit the shape of what the world expected from a barber's Italian son. Felt like suffocation, so he left. What followed was a decade of becoming. He dealt cards in illegal gambling dens. He worked as a mill hand. He boxed under the name Kid Crocetti, taking punches to the jaw for money, learning early that pain was something you absorbed quietly and walked away from. Somewhere in those years of grind and hustle, and watching his own hands bleed under cheap lights, he discovered that he could sing, not just adequately, not just pleasantly. He could sing in a way that made people stop moving, stop talking, stop whatever they were doing, and simply listen. He started performing in small clubs, Italian weddings, roadhouses that smelled of cigarettes and spilled beer. He changed his name to Dean Martin, because Dino Crocetti was never going to get booked anywhere in 1940s America that wanted to pretend Europe didn't exist. And even then, even with the new name, the bookings were hard to come by. He was turned away from clubs that didn't want Italians. He was told his voice was too ethnic, too rich, too something that the mainstream wasn't ready for. He smiled through every rejection, and he waited, and he kept singing, and deep inside him, in that place where a person stores the things that never heal completely, every dismissal left its mark. Then came Jerry Lewis, and everything changed. Their partnership is one of the great accidents of show business history, the kind of collision that produces something neither person could have created alone. Dean was 27. Jerry was 20. And when they found themselves performing together at the 500 Club in Atlantic City in 1946, something electric happened on that stage that neither of them fully understood at the time. Dean would sing, serious and smooth and impossibly handsome, and Jerry would erupt into chaos around him, falling over furniture, making faces, destroying the elegant atmosphere Dean had just constructed. The audience lost their minds. They screamed. They cried with laughter. They came back night after night. Martin and Lewis became the biggest act in America with a speed that shocked the entertainment industry to its foundations. Television, radio, film, sold-out concert tours. They conquered everything simultaneously. Dean was 29 years old, and suddenly the world was at his feet. And yet, every interview, every profile, every headline positioned him as a straight man. The handsome backdrop against which Jerry's genius exploded. The suit that held the comedy together. Some critics barely mentioned him at all, as though he were a piece of furniture that happened to be able to carry a tune. The Italian kid from Steubenville who'd spent a decade being told he wasn't enough had made it to the top of the mountain, and found out that even there, people found ways to make you feel like you were taking up space that belonged to someone else. He smiled through it. That was what Dean Martin did. He took the feeling and he compressed it down into something small and manageable, and he buried it under the smile and the scotch and the easy laugh. But it was always there. It was always there. The split from Jerry Lewis in 1956 was cataclysmic by any measure. The public wept. The press wrote eulogies for both careers. Everyone assumed that Dean without Jerry was like a song without a melody. Pleasant perhaps, but missing the essential thing. The conventional wisdom of Hollywood in 1956 said that Dean Martin was about to disappear. Nobody said this quietly. They said it loudly in print, in columns that were read by millions of people who nodded along, because it seemed so obviously true. What happened instead is one of the great second acts in American entertainment history. Alone, free for the first time from being anyone's supporting act, Dean Martin reinvented himself so completely and so brilliantly that within 5 years the person he became would make the partnership years look like a rehearsal. The films came, not slapstick comedies, but westerns and thrillers and musicals where he was simply, undeniably the center of gravity in every frame. The Rat Pack formed around him and Frank Sinatra like a solar system around two suns. And suddenly Dean wasn't a sidekick or a straight man or a backdrop for anyone. He was the epitome of cool in an era that worshiped cool above almost everything else. There was something about the way Dean Martin occupied space in the world that people found genuinely, helplessly magnetic. He moved slowly. He spoke quietly. He laughed easily and often. He gave the impression, carefully, masterfully constructed, though those who knew him best would tell you it was also somehow completely authentic, that absolutely nothing could trouble him, that the world's anxieties and protocols and expectations simply slid off him like rain off silk. In an era of desperate conformity, of men straining to perform the right behaviors in the right rooms to earn the approval of the right people, here was a man who seemed to have simply opted out of the whole machinery. And people loved him for it with an intensity that went beyond mere celebrity worship. They loved him for it the way starving people love the sight of food. But there was a price. There is always a price. The British Royal Command Performance was one of the most prestigious entertainment events in the world. It had been held annually since 1912. A gala evening at which the cream of international entertainment performed before the reigning monarch in a grand showcase of talent and cultural exchange. To be invited was an honor that most performers pursued their entire careers. To be chosen to headline the American delegation was something even rarer. And in the year that Dean Martin found himself on that invitation list, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. This was a period of intense, complicated diplomatic and cultural negotiation between the United States and Great Britain. The war had reshuffled the world's hierarchies in ways that both countries were still processing, and the relationship between them, the famous special relationship, required constant tending. Cultural events like the Royal Command Performance were not simply entertainment. They were soft power in its most refined form. They were a statement about nations and values, and the kind of people who represented those nations to the world. The American performers selected to attend were not just celebrities. They were, whether they wanted to be or not, ambassadors. The briefings began weeks before the event. American performers and their representatives were given detailed, thorough instruction on proper royal protocol. You were to arrive at a specified time. You were to dress in a specified manner. When presented to Queen, you were to bow. The men, or curtsy. The women, You were not to speak first. You were not to touch. You were not to make jokes. You were not to do a very long list of things, all of which were spelled out in crisp, official language that left absolutely no room for interpretation or improvisation. Dean Martin received this briefing. He listened to it with a pleasant, mild attention he gave to most things he had already decided not to do. The people in the room with him, his manager, representatives from the studio, a State Department liaison who'd been assigned to the American entertainment delegation, couldn't quite read his expression. That was intentional. Dean Martin's face, we chose to make it unreadable, was one of the most perfectly sealed surfaces in the world. He thanked them all for their time. He folded the briefing documents and put them in the inside pocket of his jacket, and he said nothing else about it. What was going through his mind in those weeks before the event? Those who knew him speculate, and the picture that emerges is not simple. Dean was not an anti-monarchist in any ideological sense. He was not making a political statement, or at least not a conventional one. He was not interested in rebellion for rebellion's sake. The analysis that reduces what he did to arrogance or ego misses a thing that drove it entirely, because Dean Martin had never been particularly interested in power for its own sake. What he was interested in, what he had been interested in since the day he left Steubenville with nothing but his voice and his nerve, was authenticity. The refusal to perform what he didn't feel. The stubborn, bone-deep insistence on being, at every moment, exactly who he was. He had played by the rules. He had performed the required dances of 100 rooms before this one. He had smiled for people who looked through him, dressed the way he was told to dress, said the things he was supposed to say in the order he was supposed to say them. And he had noticed, with the precise social intelligence that hid behind the easy laugh, that none of it had actually bought him what was supposed to be its reward. The barber's son from Ohio was still, in the eyes of a certain kind of person, the barber's son from Ohio. No amount of bowing changed that fundamental arithmetic. So somewhere between receiving the briefing and stepping into that grand ballroom, he made a decision, or perhaps he simply allowed himself to acknowledge a decision that had already been made. The night of the performance was everything these events are designed to be. The venue was magnificent. High ceilings hung with crystal chandeliers that cast warm gold light over a room full of people dressed in the finest clothes that 2 continents could produce. The British establishment was there in full ceremonial force. Men in uniform and women in jewels that had history stretching back centuries. The American contingent sparkled in a different register. Hollywood glamour meeting Washington propriety in an uneasy but visually spectacular amalgamation. The room smelled of flowers and perfume, and particular electric charge that filled spaces with a powerful gather, all of them simultaneously performing ease, while actually engaged in the exhausting work of being seen correctly. The performers had been told the order of presentation. They had been told where to stand, and in what sequence they would meet the Queen. The line was organized with military precision, each person positioned to receive the royal greeting and move on with exactly the right amount of time, no more, no less. Backstage, in the hours before presentation, the performers ran to the protocol again, some of them rehearsing their bows, practicing the angle of the head, the placement of the feet, all the choreography of deference. The anxiety in the room was palpable, a bright, humming nervousness that even the most seasoned performers wore visibly. This was not a stage. The rules here were different. The consequences of error felt different. Dean Martin leaned against a wall and smoked a cigarette. People observed later how completely relaxed he appeared. Genuinely relaxed, not the performed relaxation of someone managing their visible anxiety. He chatted with the other performers in the easy, unhurried way of a man at a garden party, rather than a man waiting for one of the most formal introductions of his life. He laughed at something someone said. He straightened his cuff links, not nervously, but with the simple, habitual gesture of a man who liked his cuff links to sit correctly. He was, by every account, entirely himself, which was precisely the point. When the moment came, the room took on the quality of a held breath. The Queen moved along the line of performers with the trained grace of someone who had been performing royalty since childhood, each greeting calibrated, each exchange precise and courteous and brief. The performers received her with the expected deference, bows and curtsies, heads bent, the physical grammar hierarchy enacted flawlessly down the line. The watching crowd, which occupied every available inch of space in that vast room, observe in the attentive silence that these moments demand. And then she reached Dean Martin. He did not bow. He stood with his shoulders easy and his chin level, and his dark eyes meeting hers with an expression that was not challenging, not aggressive, not anything that could be cleanly labeled disrespect. It was simply presence. He was simply, completely, undeniably there, one human being facing another across the invisible architecture protocol that the entire room existed to maintain. The cigarette was still between his fingers. He held it with the negligent elegance he brought to everything. And in the 5 seconds that followed, as the Queen processed what was not happening and the room processed it simultaneously, the silence was so complete that people would later describe hearing their own heartbeats. Then Dean Martin smiled. Not a smirk, not a performance. A real smile, warm and direct and entirely personal. The smile of a man genuinely pleased to meet someone he was looking at. And he said, quietly, conversationally, as though they were being introduced at a dinner party rather than in one of the most watched moments of the social calendar, something to the effect of hello. It's a real pleasure to meet you. The Queen looked at him for a moment. Those who were close enough to see her face described something complicated moving through her expression. Surprise, certainly, and the rapid internal recalibration of a woman trained from birth to manage the unexpected. And then, almost imperceptibly, the corners of her mouth moved. Not a full smile. Something smaller and more private than that. An acknowledgement. A recognition of something. She responded to him. Warmly, by all accounts. The exchange lasted slightly longer than the other greetings in the line, which itself was noticed by everyone in the room who was paying attention, which was everyone in the room. And then she moved on, and Dean Martin's cigarette smoke continued its lazy ascent toward the chandeliers, and the collective breath of the room was finally, gradually released. What happened in the seconds after she moved away was a slow-motion eruption. The people closest to Dean in the line turned to look at it with expressions that ranged from horror to disbelief to something approaching awe. A studio executive several places down the line was observed to have gone genuinely pale. The State Department liaison, who had been stationed near the back of the room watching the presentation with the focus of someone whose career was potentially on the line, was seen pressing his hand briefly over his mouth. Backstage, where other performers had gathered to watch through doorways, the reaction was physical. Gasps, hands grabbed, whispered profanities. And yet, the catastrophe that everyone was bracing for did not materialize. The diplomatic incident that should have followed did not follow. The formal protest, the cold shoulder, the cascade of professional consequences that protocol violations of this magnitude were supposed to produce, none of it came. What came instead was something more interesting, more confusing, and ultimately more revealing about the nature of the transaction that had just occurred in that grand ballroom. Word spread through the room before the evening was over. It spread with a speed that only truly remarkable social events travel. Person to person, whisper behind hands, passing glances and raised eyebrows, and the small seismic gestures of a crowd processing something it cannot quite categorize. By the time the evening ended and the guests moved toward their cars and their hotels, the thing Dean Martin had done was already becoming a story, and like all stories of sufficient power, it was already beginning to transform itself into telling. Some people were furious. Genuinely, righteously furious in the way that people become furious when they have invested heavily in the rules of a system and witnessed those rules casually disregarded. There were quiet, intense conversations between members of the British establishment and American diplomatic representatives. There were phone calls made from hotel rooms in the small hours of the morning. There were memos. There were discussions about whether Dean Martin's name would appear on any future invitation lists, whether the American delegation might be asked to offer some form of official acknowledgement of the breach. But there were other conversations happening simultaneously, in other hotel rooms and cars and drawing rooms, that were moving in a completely different direction. Because the Queen had smiled. The Queen had extended the conversation. The Queen, who was not required to do any of those things and who had been trained her entire life to maintain exactly the protocol that Dean Martin had just violated, had responded to him as though she found the whole encounter not offensive, not mortifying, but somehow genuinely refreshing. And when that detail made its way into the story, as it inevitably did, it complicated everything. The people who want to condemn what Dean Martin had done found themselves unable to stand on fully solid ground, because the person whose honor was supposed to have been violated had not, by any available evidence, felt that her honor had been violated. The person at the center of the protocol, the reason the protocol existed, the human being in whose name all the bowing and curtsying and careful choreography was performed. She had looked at this man who refused to bow, and she had smiled at him. And that smile, that small, private, unscripted smile, was a thing that nobody in that room could fully account for, that kept surface as a question to every tidy narrative about what the evening meant. What had she seen? What had the Queen perceived in that 5-second silence, and its aftermath that produced that response? The people who would spend years analyzing the moment came to different conclusions, but there's one thread that runs through the most thoughtful accounts of it. She had seen someone who was genuinely not afraid of her. Not in an aggressive way, not in the way of someone performing fearlessness as a statement, in the way of someone who simply, fundamentally, did not operate within the system of hierarchy and deference that she represented. And the encounter with that kind of person, someone for whom the usual instruments of social pressure simply did not function, is, for someone who almost never experiences it, something close to remarkable. Most people who met the Queen were, at some level, performing. They were performing deference or performing ease or performing the sophisticated worldliness of someone unbothered by royalty while actually being quite bothered indeed. The entire apparatus of royal protocol existed partly to manage this, to provide a structure within which the performed ease could be indistinguishable from the real thing, to smooth over the constant low-level unreality of one human being treated as categorically different from all others by everyone they encountered. Dean Martin had stepped outside that apparatus entirely. He had simply been present. And in a life surrounded by performance, that kind of presence was, perhaps, its own form of gift. The story aged in interesting ways. In the days immediately following the event, the press coverage was cautious. There were political sensitivities that kept the most dramatic version of events from full publication. But the story lived in the spaces between the official accounts, in the oral tradition of Hollywood, in the memories of the people who had been in that room. It grew, as all true stories grow with time, not distorting, but deepening, as each new person who carried it added particular light of their own understanding to the picture. Dean Martin himself said almost nothing about it publicly. This was entirely characteristic. He was not a man who explained himself or sought to contextualize his actions in ways that required others to see his choices favorably. He had done what he had done, and the doing of it was complete. And that was enough. When pressed in later interviews, and he was pressed, because journalists never entirely stopped circling this story, he would deflect with the warm, impenetrable good humor that was his signature, answering a different question from the one that had been asked and doing it so charmingly that the interviewer frequently forgot to notice. He was, in this as in everything, ungraspable. But there were moments, rare and oblique, when something more direct emerged. In one conversation, recorded by someone who knew him well and shared only in private accounts for many years afterward, he was asked why he had done it. Why that night? Why that room? Why in front of all those people and all those cameras and all that potential consequence? He was quiet for a moment, which was itself unusual, because Dean Martin was rarely quiet. And then he said something that the person who recorded it never forgot. He said that he had spent enough of his life bending for things that didn't deserve bending for. He said that a crown was just metal, and the real question was always what the person underneath it actually was. He said, and this is the part that the person who heard found most startling, most unexpectedly raw, that he had met enough real kings and queens in his life, men and women who had nothing and gave everything and never asked for a bow. And he was not going to bend his back for a symbol when he had refused to bend it for the things that actually earned that. The barber's father, the mill towns and the back rooms and the clubs that wouldn't book an Italian kid from Ohio. The decade of being the sidekick, the backdrop, the handsome straight man who held the comedy together for someone else's genius. The critics who wrote his career off in 1956. The rooms he had walked into his whole life where the question being silently asked was whether he belonged there. He was not going to bow. And yet, and this is the thing that completes the picture, that turns a story from a simple act of defiance into something genuinely extraordinary. The people who were closest to Dean Martin in those years will tell you that he was not, at his core, an angry man. The events that had shaped him had not produced bitterness. They had produced something harder to name and more interesting, a kind of radical self-possession, a complete and settled certainty about what he was and what he deserved that had nothing to do with arrogance, because arrogance requires a constant work of assertion, the ongoing project of convincing both yourself and others of your own value. Dean Martin had gotten somewhere past all of that. He had simply, quietly arrived at the knowledge of his own worth, and from that place, bowing to a stranger in a crowd, however pleasant and however genuinely dignified a stranger she might be, was simply something he didn't do. This is not as common as it sounds. Most people never get there. Most people carry their doubts and their hungers and their need for external validation so deep into their adulthood that it shapes every room they enter, every hand they shake, every bow they give or withhold. The factory of childhood tells us who we are and what we deserve, and most of us spend our whole lives either confirming that verdict or fighting it. And both of those are, at root, the same captivity. Dean Martin had done something rarer. He had looked at the verdict and recognized it for what it was, someone else's story about him, and set it down. And the freedom that followed from setting it down was not the loud, performed freedom of rebellion. It was the quiet, complete freedom of someone who had simply stopped needing what they no longer needed. The Queen's smile in this light becomes something more than a pleasant anecdote. It becomes a kind of recognition, one human being seeing in another the thing that is most rare and most worth acknowledging, not the performance of worth. Worth itself, standing there in a tuxedo with a cigarette and a level chin, needing nothing from the encounter except the encounter itself. Years later, the story of that 5-second silence would take on new dimensions as the people involved aged and died, and the distance of time allowed for reflection that proximity hadn't permitted. People who had been furious in the immediate aftermath spoke about it differently in later years. Some of them, with the honesty that age occasionally produces, said they had secretly, in the part of themselves that they hadn't been able to acknowledge in 1960 or whenever it was, admired what he had done, that the rage they'd felt in the moment was partly, perhaps mostly, the rage of people who had always wanted to do something similar and hadn't, and perhaps wouldn't, and watched this man do it with such apparent ease that the distance between his freedom and their captivity felt, for a moment, unbearable. The entertainment industry is full of stories of people who bent and bent and bent, and were rewarded with diminishment anyway, and full of stories of people who held some essential line about who they were and paid terrible prices for it. Dean Martin's story is unusual because the price, in the end, was so small, and the holding of the line so complete, and what came after, the career, the legend, the permanent enshrinement in the cultural memory of the 20th century, so magnificent. He did not bow to the Queen. He stood there and was himself. And 60 years later, the world still knows his name. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about that night is not the act itself, not the 5 seconds of silence, not even the Queen's smile. The most extraordinary thing is what it reveals about the nature of dignity and how it is actually earned and held. We tend to think of dignity as something conferred by titles, by status, by the acknowledgement of others. We perform it, we chase it, we try to purchase it through the right associations and the right behaviors in the right rooms. And the message of that evening, in the most purely distilled form, is that all of that is backwards. Dignity is not conferred. It is occupied. It is the space a person takes up when they have stopped waiting for permission to be who they are. Dean Martin walked into that ballroom as the sum of everything he had survived and overcome and refused to let diminish him. The Italian kid from the mill town, the car dealer, the boxer who took punches for rent money, the sidekick who turned out to be the main event all along. He carried all of that in the way he stood, in the easy angle of his shoulders, in the hand that held the cigarette without trembling. And when the moment came, he did what he had always done in the rooms that mattered. He showed up as himself, completely, undividedly, unapologetically himself. The Queen moved on down the line. The room breathed again. The chandelier light caught in the crystal glasses and scattered across the parquet floor. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered something to someone else, and the whisper carried the seed of everything this story would become. And Dean Martin finished his cigarette and went on with his evening, carrying nothing extra, owed nothing to the moment that he hadn't already paid in full by the simple act of being present in it. That is the truth of what happened in those 5 seconds. Not defiance, though it looked like defiance. Not arrogance, though some saw arrogance. Not politics, though politics would try to claim it afterward. It was something simpler and stranger and harder to articulate than any of those things. It was a man who had learned, through the specific and grinding education of a particular life, that the only thing worth having is the thing you can hold on to when every other thing is stripped away. The approval of rooms, the nod of power, the acknowledgement of hierarchies, all of it temporary, all of it contingent, all of it finally, fundamentally, not the thing. The thing was what he carried inside himself, and that thing bowed to no one. Somewhere in a grand ballroom that no longer exists in its original form, in a year that belongs to history now, a woman in a crown met a man from Ohio who had reinvented himself completely and arrived at the far side of that reinvention with his essential nature not just intact but purified, sharpened, made more fully itself by the long process of becoming. And in 5 seconds of silence that nobody who was there ever forgot, they recognized each other, across every distance of class and nation and protocol and expectation, as two people who understood something about the cost of being who you actually are. And the smile that followed was not the smile of a queen for a celebrity. It was the smile of one human being for another who had, in the middle of all performance and pressure and spectacle, managed to be simply, irreducibly real. That is what you cannot bow away. That is what no protocol can reach. That is what Dean Martin knew and showed that night, and what the room, despite itself, despite all its fury and its fear and its hunger for the comfort rules followed, could not entirely deny. Some truths arrive in 5 seconds. Some truths take a lifetime to earn. In that ballroom, on that night, both things were true at exactly the same moment. And the resonance of that collision is why the story is still being told, still being felt, still arriving with its quiet force into present tense, as though it happened not in the buried past, but just now, just a moment ago, in a room full of chandeliers and held breath in one man's cigarette smoke rising toward the light.